My name's Ben Blackwell. I teach theology and church history and New Testament, primarily at Houston Baptist or Houston Theological Seminary. And so we're happy to have friends around town. And so Suze has invited me to come speak about world religions. And so this week, I guess most of y'all have been here, but we've talked about the Jehovah's Witnesses. We talked about Mormonism last week. And one of the things I forgot to say at the end about Mormonism was one of the main reasons that Protestants are kind of nervous with Mormonism is, of course, they have a different Trinitarian perspective, but then also it's a view of grace that doesn't seem to fit with our reading of the Bible. But it's one of the interesting things that when we encounter Mormons, Christians are often ungraceful to Mormons. And it's not a very good witness to model a worse form of grace to someone and then say that we have the better version. And so I think with all groups that we're talking about here, a central idea is that in our postmodern age, the idea of tolerance is important for us culturally. And so this is not as hard to engage people of different religions and different traditions in a way that we wouldn't have maybe 50 or 100 years ago. But at the same time, we often struggle to do this well. Okay, so today, though, we're moving more directly into world religions, so religions that are outside the Christian tradition. Of course, we're starting with one that is adjacent here, Judaism. And one of the first questions we have to ask, actually, with Judaism is what counts? Who are we talking about here? Is it just a racial background? So people that descended from Isaac and Jacob. And that's one marker of Judaism. But the issue there is that some people from that tradition intermarried with other traditions. So there are Black Jews, there are European Anglo-Jews, there are Middle Eastern Jews. And so it doesn't easily just devolve down to that racial side of things. Of course, then there's the question of those who are practicing Jews religiously, right? And so we're going to talk about that diversity. But there are many Jews that don't practice any religion, right? They would consider them atheist. And so if you limit it to one side or the other, and so the population range that you see, in fact, I'll start off with our question here. You'll see a wide range of populations given to Jewish population in the world, because you have from practicing you're ethnically Jewish and that you practice Judaism to this higher number of the 24 million that includes people that have a parent or a grandparent that are Jewish, perhaps in other forms, but maybe not practicing Judaism as well. And so here's this question for you. What percentage of Jews live in Israel? We got any votes for 12? 12, okay. 36, okay. 45? Yep. 64, anybody? No? It's 36, actually. So now again, part of this depends on who you're counting here. If you're counting the smaller number, just the 15 million number, then it's about 45, roughly equal to the U.S., about 6 million in each. But if you count kind of the wider ethnic, so if you have a family heritage who is Jewish, but you're not necessarily practicing yourself, the Judaism, then the numbers swell in the U.S., actually. That's the largest group there. In fact, the 45% is the U.S. percentage. So 36 is the Israel percentage and 45% is the U.S. And so, of course, this is highly driven by World War II, when Judaism primarily was located centrally in Europe. And of course, with the Holocaust, 1/3 of Jews were put to death there, and many others then left. And so Europe now has less than 10%. All right, so one of the ways then we want to do this is talk about Jewish history. And I was listening to a Jewish rabbi, and he said, here's the short history of Judaism, right? They tried to kill us. we survived, and so let's go eat, right? And so it is a tough history to walk through and talk through, because it is just this series of negative and difficult events to talk about. And of course, for us as a church to talk about this is even harder, because most of Jewish history is in Europe or other Christian areas of the world. And so Christians are often the propagators of this struggle against Judaism. And now, I don't want to excuse Christians at all for this. Christians were often quite evil to other Christians or other groups as well, too, right? So we have a mixed history here, right? And so I think it takes some hard looks at ourselves and what that is. And of course, part of our drive towards tolerance today is trying to make to live better than those that came before us. So one of the things about Jewish history is that they have a different calendar. So this is the 5,782. So it doesn't actually go back to kind of the Christian dating of the history of the world, which would take into a little bit earlier time frame. But it's basically, right, they're not thinking in terms of before Christ and after Christ, in terms of Jesus as the Messiah. And so they're dating it from the creation of the world, or the year of the world is the Anno Mundi there. All right, so you wouldn't let me get away with such a simple discussion of history. So we're going to walk through these 4 different major eras of Jewish history. My expertise is biblical studies, and so Judaism and the Bible, and that time frame of when the New Testament arises. This first one is where my expertise is. Publish some in there, but then we'll also push into Rabbinic Judaism. Judaism as we know it formed during this time, in that sense of like the practice of Judaism that looks unique, that would have that echoes of if you walked into a modern synagogue today, for instance. It goes back to that very much, the specific practices, and then also the medieval and then the 20th century. So here, if I can help myself to give you some run through of biblical history, this is an easy outline. You've got 6, 7 E words here, right? So Eden with Adam and Eve, election, God choosing this people. This is a really interesting question. Why did God choose the Jews? Does he love them more than he loves other people? Sometimes we think in those terms, right? Even Paul will quote this passage from Genesis, I believe or I can't remember where the quotation is from, but it's in Romans 9 where he talks about Jacob I loved and Esau I hated, right? Even using that strong language of love and hate of why he chose this family. But if you look at the Old Testament, the purpose for God choosing the Jews, so Genesis 12 is the main passage where Abraham comes in the story. So humanity was created good, right? They sinned. You've got Noah, you've got the Tower of Babel, everything's bad. And the rest of the story is from Abraham and his family. So Genesis 12 is this major turning point in the Bible. And it says, I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. But my purpose is to bless all nations through you. And so it's not because God loved them more, it's because he chose them because they have a special vocation, a purpose to bring that blessing to others. And so interestingly enough, other forms of religion that we've talked about, so like Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, even Christianity, right? We do that by evangelism, by going out and preaching that story. Part of Judaism's blessing of the world was remaining distinct, being a distinct and unique nation rather than assimilating into. And so that's an interesting way. And of course, they have assimilated through culture and society and things like that, but still often what's made Judaism last for the 4,000 or 5,000 years that they've been a part of world culture is their ability to remain distinct. We don't know all the cultures that come from small regional areas. So the land of Israel is about as big as like Arkansas or something, except for it's long and skinny. So maybe New Jersey would be a better comparator. So to have a people group that has originated from a piece of land that small, that is at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. So one reason Judaism has struggled so much with suffering through the years is because this is where all the marauding armies going to fight other big nations, right? It's the crossroads there. And so they're not necessarily the reason why somebody would come there. They're just on the way to go fight somebody else, and so they take over them as well. But the fact that this people has survived for so long is because they have that sense of common identity, that sense of distinction from other people instead of assimilating in. So we have Eden, election, Exodus, Moses, obviously quite important to Jewish tradition. He would be the hero, right? So if Christianity is based around Jesus, ultimately, Judaism is based around Moses because he is the one who gave the Torah, received the Torah, the written Torah as we have it, the Bible, as they say, but then also the oral Torah that we'll talk about later. Establishment of the nation with David. You have the exile. It's interesting, this time of exile, when the Babylonians come in, are quite important for all of the groups that we're talking about here, because with Jehovah's Witnesses, this exile is how they set the return of Christ in 1914, although they had the wrong date for it, both for the return of Christ and for the date of the exile. With Mormonism, right, it was this, when the Babylonian exile happened, this was when Jews came to North America, they said, right? So it's a fundamental moment there. And then also here with Judaism, it's what sets up Judaism for the destruction. There is what happens of the first temple, the temple that Solomon built. And it sets up this pattern that Judaism can exist without a temple. And so the whole modern synagogue system arose when the Jews were taken into exile here at that point, around 586 BC. Of course, they returned. They built a second temple. And so there's a whole movement now today in the past 50, 70 years of scholarship to engage the New Testament as a reflection of Second Temple Judaism. So Jews that lived during that time, during the rebuilt temple, and what does that look like? And so one of the major ways that we have witness to that are through a guy named Josephus, who wrote the Jewish history at that time. And we've had access to him for a long time. But also, you'll know in the 1940s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, right? And so we had a witness to Jews that were writing during that time, at the exact time of Jesus and the early New Testament. And so we have a witness to what the Jews think about that. Of course, there are other wildly different views of Judaism or ways to be Jewish outside of Israel as well. So, and that's Suze McVeigh has done her doctoral work on a collection of writings called the Sibylline Oracles. And it's a much more engaged, assimilated to the wider Greek world. But there's whole different ways of being Jewish during this time frame. And then we have this last one, the exchange of control, where it goes back and forth, right? So you've got the Babylonians, the Persians that come through, the Greeks. So the movie 300 is this movie about the Persians and Greeks, right? That's the same, Israel's caught in the middle of that. One of the major things, the festival of Hanukkah, is the celebration of the Maccabees throwing off this Greek oppression, because the Greeks tried to make them assimilate, outlaw Judaism, sacrificed a pig in the temple, all these kinds of things. And the Jews had basically an insurgency. They were the smaller group that pushed off this larger thing, and that God's help was what carried them through. And that's what the festival of Hanukkah is to celebrate God's victory over there. So they had a bit of self-rule. Then the Romans came in, and eventually the Romans came and destroyed that second temple. Interestingly enough, the Colosseum in Rome, who's been to Rome and seen the Colosseum, was built with Jewish money. So when they destroyed the temple, they took all the gold artifacts. They used that money to pay for the people to build the Colosseum, and likely used slaves from Israel, because often when you would go and defeat a group, you bring the slaves back, right? You have these triumphs back in Rome. They would likely use Jewish slaves to build the Colosseum. So that's an aspect. The Arch of Titus is right next to that in Rome. And it actually shows pictures of reliefs on that of their destruction of Rome, and they're bringing the Jewish menorah into Rome itself. So there's a little bit of Judaism as it fits within that. The top picture, we had a time machine, went back to first century Judaism. No, they built a small model. It used to be at a hotel, at the Holy Land Hotel. Great name. They dismantled this model and then rebuilt it at the museum there in Israel and Jerusalem. And today, as you'll see down there on the bottom right, that big wall there is the retaining wall that went around and built up that temple. So, of course, when Islam came, they built a mosque on top of that where the temple had been. But the Romans destroyed it they were so angry about the Jews with that rebellion and the later one about 50 years later, they razed the whole Temple Mount. I mean, they scraped it flat and pushed every bit of stone off of the temple where the first century temple stood because they didn't want anything else to be built there. And so all that remains then is the wall, the retaining wall. So Jerusalem is a hilly place. And so in the first century, they built up these extra walls so they could expand the place for the temple. And so many Christians know this as the Wailing Wall. Most Jews don't call it that. They call it just the Western Wall, or HaKotel, just the wall. And of course, it's a holy place. One of the things that you'll do if you go to the wall is that people will write prayers on pieces of paper and put them in the cracks and the crevices there. You can't see it here very well, but on the bottom there of the wall, on the left-hand side, is where the men have, and in this picture, they've got different tables out for people to read Torah and pray, and then the women will pray on the smaller section there that's a little bit darker on the bottom right there. Have to say this here. One of the things, actually, we're wanting to build a model this first century. So that's actually a 126 model. You can walk around it. We actually want to build one of those here in Houston as part of our seminary. And so if anybody has this interest in church history, I can't help myself but ask if you want to be a part of that. It's part of our 10, 15-year goal to fundraise for that, to build something here in Houston. All right, so Jewish history. So we've talked about the early biblical history. The rest of this is going to be, I'm going to do a little bit quicker here, as much because it's not my expertise, but we get lost in the details of the names, right? Jehovah's Witnesses, we had about 150 years. Mormons, we hit Jehovah's, was it? Anyhow, numbers-wise, I'm getting lost here, but a couple hundred years, with Mormonism. We're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 years with Judaism, right? So we're going to have to go much quickly and differently here. But what happened is after the temple was destroyed, there arose about 50 years later another reform movement within Judaism. A messianic leader was put forward. His name was Bar Kokhba, was his nickname, the son of the star. And he was unsuccessful as well. And then the Romans defeated the temple once. They came back in this 50 years later and then just wiped out. And so most of the Jews left. In fact, they couldn't even go into Jerusalem anymore. It was just made a totally secular city. And so at this point, Judaism began to spread out much more over the ancient world. Of course, through the Babylonian exile that happened 500 years before, there was still a large contingent of Jews there. And we see this through stories like in the book of Tobit in the Apocrypha. It tells the stories of Jews living during that Babylonian period. And so there are many Jews that stayed there. They never came back to Israel. And so then when the Romans kicked the Jews out, many went back to Babylonia. And so part of this then was, how do we live as Jews without the temple, right? What does it mean? What does it mean when you don't have this priesthood, the sacrificial system? And so part of this, they codified what it looked like to live just when you're following the Torah without the temple. And so this is what the Mishnah is. It was written around 200 AD. And so, if you read the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, as we call it, it's story, it's law, it's this intermixed. There are different times, different places. What the Mishnah does is codify it, right? It puts it all in order, explains how to live, how to be Jewish. And the Jews will call this the oral Torah, right? You have the written Torah and the Bible, and then this is the oral Torah. But even then, it explained what these were, but then part of the whole idea of being Jewish is debating, talking. And so what is the Mishnah? It's Rabbi so-and-so says this, but Rabbi X and Y says that, right? So you're debating. It's this dialogue. It's not, sometimes in Christianity, we want to get right to just what's the right answer, right? There's truth and it's there. Well, in Jewish practice and theology, it's much more, hey, the text says this, it can be read in different ways. Let's talk through. And so talking through how to interpret it is as important as the outcome that you get in that. And so part of that then is settling that. Well, there were still more things more discussions that went on, and the Talmud then includes the Mishnah, and it's basically a commentary on the Mishnah, how the Mishnah relates to the Bible, but then and tells a lot of stories of the histories of different rabbis, and then also more of their debates. So if you go to a synagogue today, so I went to synagogue to a Shabbat service, a Friday night service, about a month ago, and they read the biblical text, what we would call the Old Testament. They call it the Hebrew Bible. They'll read a text from that. But then the sermon was about the Talmud's reading of that text. So a rabbi says, we see in this, it talks about different sacrifice. We don't do that sacrifice anymore. So what does that mean for us spiritually today and things like that? Moving on just quickly here. So, of course, all sorts of things, struggles from pagan nations there during this early time, the early rabbinic time. The medieval time is where both Christians and Muslims give Jews a hard time. Things divide out here culturally because if you'll remember that North Africa, Israel is all administered by Muslim nations at this point, and especially even Spain. And there are tons of Jews lived in Spain. And so we get the term Sephardic Jews from Jews that lived in this Mediterranean area under Muslim control, and particularly the Jews in Spain. And when the Muslims were actually quite open to Jews, they viewed them as, progenitors. I mean, they see Abraham and Moses and David as prophets, Muslims do. And so they had space for Judaism. The modern contention, hatred even that we would talk about between Jews and Muslims arises just in the 20th century about the founding of Israel. Now, it doesn't mean they were always well received, but they found a trove of Jewish documents in Cairo that spanned centuries, and it was not just religious texts, but contracts and marriage and all this kind of stuff. And it shows that Jews lived in what we'd consider medieval Cairo fairly and flourished there. But at times, right, it comes and goes. Other times, so when Spain fell to the Christians, at the same time, there was a more kind of conservative group of Muslims that took over that area. And so they purged and pushed out the Jews. And so they moved back into other parts of the Mediterranean. So that's Sephardic Judaism. The Judaism that we would encounter here in the U.S. is usually 90%, 95% Ashkenazi Judaism. And these are Jews that lived in Christian areas of Europe. So France originally, but then moved into Germany and Poland and the Ukraine are primary areas where Ashkenazi Jews. And so there are different forms since they were in different parts of the world. They kind of grew up, had different forms of the way this went. Let's see if there's anything that's important here. Importantly here, anti-Judaism as a Christian outcome is not just a Protestant or a German issue. The Jews under the Eastern Orthodox in Russia, even the word pogrom that we have here, are for people that are not Lutheran or Reformation Protestant, right? Jews, by and large, had trouble throughout Europe. Now, one of the things that is outlawed for them to own property and things like this, and so they tended to go into trades that were things that didn't demand property. And so in this sense, this is why money lending or banking was, because you didn't have to have physical goods that way. And of course, that was both good. The Christian Europe liked that when they wanted to borrow money. They also didn't like it when they got into debt. And so it was a common way to kick the Jews out of the country. This happened in England and other parts when you wanted to absolve this debt because you could oppress this minority group by doing that. And of course, there are all these other things that go into that are when we get to the 20th century then, right, this is when all the wheels come off. So in some ways, after the Enlightenment, this is in the American Revolution in the 1700s, the French Revolution in the 1700s, there was this acceptance to Judaism that there hadn't been throughout history because there was this move to just religious tolerance. Part of this time frame was, and this is why America is what it is why we didn't have an established church. England, the Queen is the leader of the Church of England, right? In Germany, the state receives taxes on behalf of the church, right? So you pay your tithe into the church. It's usually a 3%. Whether you're Protestant or Catholic, it will go to the Lutheran or the Catholic Church. The state takes that money, so you don't have to do it through the church. Ministers in Switzerland are paid by the Swiss government for the Reformed Church there. So when the U.S. and France did this, they're like, look, we don't want the state running the church anymore, or that mixture. And so in France then, where these Jews were at, they had a sense of inclusion in society, because if the state's not going to run religion, that means we're not going to make everybody be the same. And so there was a bit of tolerance there. And so, of course, that tolerance didn't last when the wars happened, when economic downturns happen. As we know, minorities often bear the brunt of that. If you want a book that talks about this time frame, about the establishment of the State of Israel, it predates the Holocaust, World War II, the initial movements of that, but of course it came there. This is a story, this Leon Uris. It's about Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then how they were attempting to get to Israel. And the deal was, even though people were against the Holocaust, they weren't helpful to the Jews, right? The U.S. didn't enter World War II to stop the Holocaust. We didn't accept many Jews at all. In fact, we rejected Jews fleeing Nazi Germany before the war. And so this is a story of how these Jews were trying to navigate just getting out of Europe, but then where would they go and when they came to Israel. Museum called the Yad Vashem. Yad just means hand, and Shem is the name. It means the name. It's a way to talk about God. And the hand of God was still at work even in the midst of this horrible. So something like 1/3 of worldwide Jews were put to death in the Holocaust. And if you didn't know that, Houston actually has a Holocaust museum as well. Have exhibits that come through. They talk about contemporary social issues as well as the Holocaust as well. Hard things there for sure. All right, so as we're moving on here to what does it look like if you're a practicing Jew? Again, a lot of people are ethnically Jewish. What does it look like to be a practicing Jew? So one of the main ones is Shabbat, Sabbath, right? So you typically have a shorter service on Friday night. So of course, Sabbath runs from the night of, right? So before the sun goes down, to sundown of the next day. So you'll typically have a short service on Friday night, about an hour. So, and then the Saturday morning service is often 2 or 3 hours long, because the part of the Shabbat service is, so in our services, right, you read 2 readings each week, right? So you have usually one of the letter, and especially a gospel reading. That might be long. Might take, a long reading for us might take 2 or 3 minutes. Well, they're going to read through the whole Torah in 1 year. And so they literally read through the whole Torah. So they have basically a Jewish lectionary, and it just takes a long time to read that text. So they might spend 30 or 40 minutes reading the weekly portion of the Torah, as well as the other prayers and things that go on there. Of course, one of the big things, this is all read out in Hebrew, right? At least in traditional synagogues. We'll get to their synagogues now that do all their services in the local language, but traditional synagogues there. And then we have the mitzvot, or a mitzvah is the word for commandment. So a bar mitzvah is a son of the commandment, or a bat mitzvah is the daughter of commandment. Of course, that's like confirmation in a Christian church. This is when, you're taught to read Hebrew. You'll do prayers and read the text for the community at that point. But you have, you're a practicing member there. Of course, there's prayers that you do. The Shema is probably the famous one. This comes from Deuteronomy 6:4. The passage, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength." And so it's Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol lavavka, with all your heart, uv'kol nafshecha, uv'kol meodecha, with all your heart, soul, and strength. And so this is what probably the most common prayer in Judaism. And so you would say it daily, things like this. You eat kosher, of course, we'll be familiar with that, and then various festivals. All right, I've put enough of you to sleep here. So here's the question. Of the 6 million Jews in Israel, what percentage are secular? So are Jewish in ethnicity alone, but do not practice the faith? So got votes for 8%? No? 10? 29? Okay, 53. It is the 53, unfortunately. You think about it, and this is what I found with Christians in Europe as well. England, I lived in England for 5 years, very secular. I think World War I and World War II were quite damaging to almost all forms of faith. And so unfortunately with Judaism as well. Of course, that many people that moved to Europe to Israel, left such great suffering. So for Israel there, right, you have about half. The other half are mixed between these different versions. The ultra-Orthodox is the Haredi, as they're known as, the Orthodox, and then just middle of the road people, right? So what that is. In the U.S., it falls out. In fact, I was talking to my wife with this, that the percentage of secular Jews in the U.S. seems underrepresented here. My guess, again, it depends on which, if it's the big number or the small number, right? The conservative Jews are not that conservative. I guess maybe this is a good way to say this. They would be kind of the mainline Jews in that sense. So they're conservative in some ways, but they're conservative over against the Reform Jews who would practice Judaism they're not going to have Hebrew as part of the synagogue service right. So if you go to a Shabbat service at a conservative synagogue that I went to, so I know a little bit of Hebrew, I can keep up with the prayer book, but I don't know most of what's going on, right? And so in a Reform synagogue, it's all going to be here in America, all in English, and so whether you're Jewish or not, you can participate in that. The Reform Judaism will have women that are rabbis. Conservative will as well, but not Orthodox, right? And so there's these different versions of gender roles, of language, and other things like that. All right, so for the sake of time here, I didn't spend as much time going through the practices or the theology of Judaism, but this is, there's a medieval Jewish rabbi, Maimonides, who came up with these 13 principles of faith. And so they're actually part of the prayers and structures, the Yigdal prayer, there are other prayers that happen in the synagogue service. And so Judaism is as diverse as Christianity. So you can think of Pentecostal to Baptist to like Lutheran, Episcopalian to Catholic to Orthodox to, right? And then we've got other Jewish groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormon, right? There's a huge diversity. And there's that equal amount of diversity within Judaism. And so it's hard to point and say, what does it mean? You know, what's a Christian view of God? Well, I can tell you the Trinity and some other things. But how we engage God and do all their practices, so diverse, it's hard to say that. And Judaism as well, because it's so, even though it's unique identity from particular cultures, it was also very good about engaging local cultures as well, right? And so that's why there's so much diversity as well. So let me point to a couple things here. They've got the written and the oral Torah, so the tradition that the Mishnah and the Talmud are quite important as well as the Bible itself. They tend to have a much more kind of like the view that humans have agency. It's not that God has to do everything. This is part of Protestant theology, justification. It happens at conversion. The whole idea of here is you have the responsibility, you have the power to do this. And so God's grace is much more cooperation with us rather than kind of enforcing things. And that happens to do with the rewards and obedience, that the Messiah is coming, right? That Jews have not rejected the idea that a Messiah will come. They just don't think Jesus was that Messiah. And so as I've talked to rabbis and things, I mean, the strongest argument that rabbis use for this is if you read the Old Testament when it says the Messiah will come, so like Isaiah, what does Isaiah say will happen during this time? Well, the wars will cease, right? Lions will lay down with lambs. Kids will play with snakes and not be bitten. And they're like, if Jesus was the Messiah, we wouldn't have so much evil in the world, right? And so Christians, right, this is a big dilemma for Christianity of kind of what we call the already and the not yet. The already, God's kingdom is already here, but it's not yet fully here. We're waiting on Christ's second coming for that resolution to happen. But that's one of the main things. And of course, what does a resurrection look like? Totally different views in Christianity, lots of different diversity there in Judaism as well. All right, so I've left time here for questions. So what question do you have? Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. So Messianic Jews, the Jews for Jesus, right? There are a couple of Messianic synagogues here in town, and I didn't even go think to look up their numbers. But I will say this: there is a big push, particularly in evangelical Christianity, to re-engage Jewish theology. Now, my dad is a great example of this. Like, loved the 7 years of repayment of loans. These different things of like as a marker for different end times. The 4 blood moons, the Shemitah, as a way to engage this Jewish theology to undergird kind of Christian prophecy. The Jews for Jesus don't necessarily follow it to that direction, but there is a greater engagement of Judaism within Christian practice than there has been, I'd say, probably the history of culture since the first century. But numbers-wise, percentage, it's hard for me to... Yes?
So the Jews are still waiting for a Messiah. What do they think that Messiah is going to be like?
Yeah, so they're just like us. There are different ways that we talk about the Messiah. So the question is, what do they think the Messiah will look like? Well, it depends on which group, So like, you've got the Jehovah's Witnesses, and in Christianity it says Jesus has already returned. You've got others that say he's not, right? And I wouldn't say the Jehovah's Witnesses are an Orthodox version of Christianity in that sense, but it does show the diversity of ways that we can talk about what it's going to look like when Jesus comes. One of the main things is that they don't think he will be God, right? The Messiah it just means anointed one, somebody who's had oil poured over their head. And this is David. This is how he was marked out as king. He'll be a human leader that leads people back to Torah faithfulness. And so a lot of ways, the easiest marker of this is, say, the Maccabees. There's a Jewish yeshiva, that's their term for a seminary training in New York, and they've spawned out this a cappella group called the Maccabees. So I encourage you to go look them up on YouTube, the Maccabees. But they've got a great song on Hanukkah, but Hanukkah was this celebration of when the Jews threw off this pagan Greek oppression, right? They were sacrificing pigs in the temple. They outlawed circumcision, outlawed Torah observance. And so what happened? The Maccabee family, the Hasmonean family, arose to, under God's leadership, to throw off this and reestablish Torah faithfulness, reestablish people to, and so it's this kind of model, right? So, of course, some Jews are looking for that firm political kind of top-down version. When I was talking to another rabbi, he was like, I don't want the temple to be rebuilt here in Israel today. Because if it's rebuilt, somebody is going to be running it, and classic move is they will exclude some people from participation in the temple and only allow other people, right? And he's like, the whole idea of Judaism now is that it's much more accepting or like engaged. And so he's a conservative. And so he's worried that the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox would run the temple. And so he doesn't think the temple should be rebuilt. And I was like, that's an interesting kind of perspective on how leadership works within the Jewish community. Because they don't have the version of like us, a pope or the archbishop or something like that. It's much more distributed leadership. Yeah, other questions? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so yes, that's a New Year is tied with that, yes. Yeah, so the question is about the Day of Atonement and Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh means the beginning, and Hashanah means the year. So it's the Jewish New Year, right? Is in September. And so there are different festivals throughout the year. So Passover, we'll know, is in the spring, of course, tied with Easter. And then you have Pentecost is the Shavuot, which is a celebration. It's a harvest festival, but it's also a celebration when Moses received the Torah. And then you have these fall festivals that come together. So you have Day of Atonement there. Sukkot is this other, is the tabernacles when Jews will live out, they'll camp out in their backyard, right? And so it's to remind them that they're a people on the move. In this sense, it's tied up with this festival of the Day of Atonement. It's more of a fast. It's not so much, since that was more of a priestly kind of thing, it tended not to be something that was directly done within lay Judaism, I guess is what I would say there. And so in this sense, we, once the temple was destroyed, Judaism moved away from a temple theology that God needed sacrifices to mediate forgiveness. Well, this is a side note here, but if you see somebody with the last name of Cohen, Cohen, that's the word for priest in Judaism. So they're usually a marker that they're from a priestly family. But again, the priests are not functioning for 2,000 years, and so there's not a sense of atonement through the sacrificial system that way. It's more through repentance and things like that. Yes? Okay, what happens after death? I would say that is just as diverse as Christian views, right? So there's some that think, you'll go to heaven, some that are more kind of universalistic. Because again, Judaism is not an evangelistic religion, right? So it's more like you have this sense of belief in God. So whereas others there's such a diversity of views of what happens to Gentiles versus Jews after death in that sense of like, it's more clear what would happen to Jews than, but there isn't this sense that they need to evangelize everybody so that they have a personal faith in the same way that Jews do, because the whole idea is they were called out to a special task, not necessarily to a religious evangelism there. But it's some, it's such a diversity there. So whatever you can think of, they're probably represented. I couldn't tell you what that's the difference. Orthodox and conservative and Reform in America will have more, tend to have, the Orthodox tend to have more kind of conservative views or traditional views on kind of what happens after conservative, kind of the middle of the road people, and then Reform are all over the place. That's what I found. Yes. Yeah, so the question is the burial practices. There is a sense to where the hope of the resurrection of the dead is important to the Jewish theology. I'm not sure about the clothing aspect of that, but there has been a practice that if you had an amputated limb, that you would put it in the casket as well too, because the whole body would be resurrected, and so you want everything there. And so in that sense, cremation has not been practiced by and large by Jews. And Christians kind of were initially influenced by this, but if you go to Europe today, about 95% of Christians are cremated in Europe because of running out of land mass. And U.S., that's becoming much more popular here as well for Christians. And so part of these traditions then are theological and part of them are pragmatic, I guess is what I would say there. All right, I see that I've hit my time, so I want to be cautious with that. But thank you. And next week, we will talk about Islam and Muslims, and then the week following, Buddhism and Hinduism together. So